Hi, I'm Katie Walton. I'm a leadership development specialist and coach, and I'm also the owner of Makeville Progress Development and Coaching. So I'm fundamentally passionate about giving people the tips and the techniques and the tools to be able to communicate more effectively and build better relationships. And what I'm doing today is working for the NHS South East Leadership Academy and recording a series of 3 leadership shorts for you, all on the topic of challenging conversations. So the first one focused on the relationships and getting the relationships right to be able to have the best kind of conversation. The second one was around thinking about your thinking. So the thinking that you do before and during a conversation to make sure you get the best outcome. And this one is around the words, thinking about the words that you can use to get the best possible outcome from your conversation. So we'll be about 10 to 15 minutes in total, and my aim is that you leave this with some real clear ideas on the words that you can use to get the best outcome possible. So when we choose our words, it's quite useful to be intentional about the way we go about things rather than leaving it to chance and getting in the middle of a conversation and suddenly realizing that you don't have the words there. So this is why I think this 10-15 minutes will be super valuable for you. And here's why words matter. So the words that we use can change the nature, the size, the shape of the emotions that are felt by other people. And they can really make a fundamental difference between the progress and the performance that people make as a result of the conversation, or completely ruining the relationship and not seeing any difference in performance whatsoever. There was a really great bit of research by a company called Vital Smarts, and it was all around the study of cues. So British people typically love a cue and quite obedient, and so find it very easy to get in line when we see a cue there. The question Vital Smarts asked their volunteers was, well, how often would you address a queue jumper? And interestingly, almost 100% of people said, yes, I'd address a queue jumper. And then when they mocked up some scenarios later on, they actually saw that nobody at all addressed the queue jumper when it came down to it. So then they decided to use a plant. So they used an actor who replicated the queue jumping, and then another actor who then addressed the queue jumper. The first time they said, oi, get to the back of the queue. And then they replayed and still nobody tackled the queue jumper. Then when they used a different set of words, or set of words that appealed to other people because it felt quite rational and fair, they realized that they had a much better, much more different response. So this time, queue jumper came along. The actor said, I'm not sure if you realize we've been waiting in line for 30 minutes. The end is just back there. And so the queue jumper left the queue, went to the back. This time, 80% of people addressed the queue jumper because they had the right words. So my aim for this is that you will leave knowing that you have got some good words, helpful words to use. First of all, a really simple framework to outline how we get the best performance from people. And I'm not just talking about those that you manage, I'm talking about, family and friends and peer-to-peer relationships. So to get the best performance out of other people, other human beings, we need a couple of things. We need, first of all, to be really clear about what's expected from them. And second of all, we need to give them some feedback or guidance to let them know what's working really well and what they need to do differently to get themselves back on track. So that's known as what's working well and even better if feedback. So when we're thinking about feedback that we might be giving to people, it's helpful to consider different styles and different preferences. So there's many different psychometrics that you can use. I want to be super simple with you for this. So it is overgeneralizing slightly, but let's just go with it for a second. So people could fall in one of two camps at the other end of the spectrum. They could either be more balloon-like or more brick wall-like in their reaction to feedback. So if you look at the characteristics of a balloon, typically you have the slightest amount of friction, they could just pop. Okay. So typically these are people that may score highly on a neuroticism scale, for example, so that they could be overly emotional, they could react very strongly to critique, for example. On the other end of the spectrum, you have your brick walls. And these are the people who are typically much more task focused, much more likely to be able to withstand quite an amount of critiques. They might be a lot more emotionally resilient, for example. So the way that you are going to approach a challenging conversation or feedback with either one of these people might be quite different. And so I think it's fair to say that most people could make an assumption. If they know somebody, if they've worked with someone for a while, are they more like a balloon, or are they more like a brick wall? So maybe think about, where are you normally, and where are you under pressure or anxiety? So you might feel like a balloon normally, but then go completely the opposite way under pressure and anxiety, or it might be the flip. But understanding that about yourself and understanding that about the other person may then help you to think about the kind of language that you're using when you want to land a really difficult message. So for example, let's go for feedback, for example. If you were to land this kind of message with someone where you say to them, in the meeting last week, you were rude and arrogant, that might be your experience, but it might not be very helpful for people to hear that from you directly. Why? Because it feels really quite accusatory. It feels quite judgmental. It can feel like a personal attack. So when we are receiving that kind of message, it might put our backs up straight away, and we might go into fight mode or flight mode or freeze mode straight away. But either way, it's not helpful to us. Better is something like this. When you interrupted me 3 times in the meeting, I felt frustrated. Could you slow down and listen more so others get a chance to talk? What I was doing there, if we break it down, is 3 things. And I call this first aid. So this is kind of the first kind of intervention that you might make with somebody when you're giving feedback. An aid stands for action, impact, and do next. So if we look at this sentence structure here, when you interrupted me 3 times in the meeting, that's the action. So we're giving them some feedback based on what we've seen and what we've heard from them. The impact is the impact on me personally. I felt frustrated. And the do next is, could you slow down and listen more? So when you have those 3 in combination, it's a really powerful way to give feedback, because people very often can't argue with the fact that they've interrupted 3 times, because that's a fact. They did it. So, and it feels much more rational and calm. So what we're doing is we're taking out the emotion. Something else to consider is if you then layer in whether somebody is more like a balloon or more like a brick wall in how they're likely to respond. It can lead us to use something called either downgraders or upgraders in our language. So what I shared with you was quite neutral in terms of a response using first aid. So quite a neutral sentence. I could downgrade it a little bit, which means it sounds quite soft in comparison. So this is very suitable for people who have quite balloon-like tendencies. And I'd be using words like a little, quite, sometimes, and perhaps. Equally, if somebody is more brick wall-like, or they're just not hearing the message that I'm giving to them, I might want to use some upgraders. And upgraders are just words that help to land the message more firmly. So things like totally, absolutely, fundamentally, always. So let me use that same sentence again, but with some examples. Downgraded. When you interrupted me 3 times in the meeting, I felt a little frustrated. Perhaps next time you could slow down and listen a bit more. It might mean others get more of a chance to talk. So what I'm doing there is not necessarily diluting the message, but I'm softening it slightly so it lands in a different way for someone that might find the other message, the original message, harder to hear. If I'm upgrading, it sounds a little bit like this. When you interrupted me 3 times in the meeting, I felt totally fed up. Next time I need you to slow down and listen so others get a chance to talk. So it's the same fundamental principle of using first aid, action, impact, do next, but it sounds more firm and more direct than the original sentence, and certainly a lot more than the one before. So just by tweaking a couple of words, you can totally shift how that sentence feels to somebody else. Now you can use that aid structure in a whole conversation. So if you want to give feedback to someone and it's not just giving them the feedback, you've got time to have a bit more of a communication. You might want to introduce the conversation, empathize. It might be hard to hear this. And then you go into the action, the impact, ask for their perception. What did you think? Then go into the do next, build agreement and say thank you. And you can use this kind of structure for any conversation, really. Anything from having to tell somebody that they smell, to having to have a conversation with a colleague who's acting way out of line, to having to challenge one of your superiors about a piece of work, for example, that isn't quite up to standard. So a really great sentence structure to use. If you're looking at giving somebody some feedback because their performance really isn't up to scratch, I love this 1, 2, 3, 4, really simple approach. So you're using quite soft language again. You start off by saying things like, I've noticed that. So I've noticed that your work isn't up to its normal standard, or I've noticed a real change in your behaviour. And you follow that with, this isn't like you, or I'm concerned, or we need to get you back on track. And then you ask for their input. What are your thoughts? What's going on? And then you finish with a coach style approach. So what do you think needs to be different? What help do you need? So this is a way of really kind of softening down some of your language. So this is particularly important if you're thinking that you're trying to build the relationship with someone. It's really ideal to kind of start low, leave yourself somewhere to go. If you go in incredibly direct and incredibly challenging, you've got nowhere left to go with that conversation. So start low, and then it means that you can bit by bit turn up the dial. So you can use more and more upgraded language or more and more direct words when you're approaching somebody, when you're talking things through. So you can shift from neutral to an upgrade, and you can shift from first aid into CPR. So let me show you that. So imagine you've already given somebody some feedback and they haven't responded in any shape or form. So rather than approaching them in a very challenging manner like this, you still haven't done what I asked you last week. So, I mean, I get you might want to say that, but it doesn't tend to land very well at all. You might want to try this, CPR. And CPR stands for check, pattern, relationship. So what we're doing here is we're checking to make sure that they've heard what we think we've said with them. Then we let them know that we've noticed that there's a pattern. So we're not letting them off the hook, and how it then impacts our relationship. So in this instance, I would be saying something like, we had a chat last week about deadlines. I just wanted to check whether I'd be being clear enough about what I needed to happen, because you've missed another 2 this week and it's becoming more regular and it's affected my trust in you, which is not what either of us want. So what I'm doing is I'm letting them know I'm on to them. We've had this conversation before, and now the ball is in their court about what happens next. And these are ideal sentence structures that you can use to have a difficult conversation with somebody about addressing their performance or their behavior, for example. And using words like this, what do you think? What's going on? I'm listening. I've noticed that. You probably heard me say that a few times. I've noticed that is incredibly powerful. And one of my all-time favorites is, I see things a little differently. And I've used this so many times when I fundamentally disagreed with somebody, because it shows respect. It shows that I'm listening to them, but that I have a different point of view. And it's a very adult approach. It's not disrespecting their viewpoint and it's not imposing mine on them. It's just saying, okay, thank you for that. I see things a little differently. Here's what I see. So it keeps, again, the emotion out of the conversation. So my top 3 tips for you to think about is, what do you want them to think, feel or do as a result of your conversation, and plan your words accordingly. Are your expectations reasonable? Are you trying to land a brick wall message with a balloon? Try and think about what you actually want to have as an outcome. And then think about what words will really help them to feel seen, heard and understood. So thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, any feedback or anything else, the contact details for you are just on the screen.